I want to tell you right now, clearly and without qualification, that what the IDF found beneath Beaufort Castle in southern Lebanon on June 7th of this year is the most operationally significant underground discovery in the history of the Israel-Hezbollah conflict. Not the most dramatic, not the most visually striking, the most operationally significant, because what was found beneath that ridge is not a tunnel, it is a doctrine. It is the physical expression of a strategic concept that Iran and Hezbollah have been developing, funding, building into the limestone bedrock of southern Lebanon for more than a decade, while Western analysts debated whether the threat was real and Israeli planners debated whether the timing was right to act. The timing became right on May 31st when IDF forces seized Beaufort Castle for the first time since the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon in the year 2000. What they found inside the ridge beneath it was not what anyone in the public commentary had prepared you for. Tonight, I want to answer 4 questions that go to the heart of what the Beaufort discovery actually means for this conflict and for the broader strategic equation that every government in the Middle East is recalculating right now. First, what exactly did the IDF find beneath Beaufort Castle? And what does the engineering of this tunnel network tell us about the strategic doctrine that built it? Second, who built this and how? Because the fingerprints on this underground complex belong not just to Hezbollah, but to Iran, and the distinction matters enormously for understanding what it tells us about Tehran's long-range planning in Lebanon. Third, what does this discovery reveal about the fundamental vulnerability of any ground force operating above an underground network it does not control? Why is this lesson one that military planners from NATO to the Pentagon are absorbing with considerable unease right now? And fourth, where does this leave the conflict? Because the Beaufort network was not the only one, it is not the last one, and the doctrine it represents is still active, still being built, and still pointed at the communities and the military positions of northern Israel in ways that the ceasefire discussion has not resolved. Stay with me, because the operational details here are going to challenge the picture that the mainstream coverage has been painting of this conflict. Before we continue, if you have been finding this analysis valuable, the kind that goes past the headlines and into the strategic reality that shapes what happens next, hit like and subscribe now so you do not miss what is coming. Drop your assessment in the comments. I read every one of them and they sharpen my own thinking. Now let us get into this completely. Beaufort Castle sits on a ridge in southern Lebanon that has been militarily significant for 9 centuries. The Crusaders built the fortress there in the 12th century because the ridge commands everything. It looks down into the Litani River Valley. It provides surveillance over the routes connecting southern Lebanon to the north. It sits 6 kilometers from the Israeli town of Metula. Whoever holds Beaufort controls the visual and fire geometry over the entire Galilee panhandle, the narrow northern finger of Israeli territory that extends toward Lebanon and that has been the most persistently threatened civilian area in northern Israel throughout the current conflict. The IDF seized it on May 31st after days of heavy fighting and sustained airstrikes. Israeli soldiers raised their flag over a fortress that Israel had last held during the occupation of southern Lebanon, a presence that ended in the year 2000 when Israeli forces withdrew, and Hezbollah immediately began building the network that the IDF discovered 30 days later beneath the same ridge. What the Golani Brigade, the Maglan Commando Unit, and the Yahalom combat engineers found when they went underground is worth describing in precise detail, because the details are what carry the strategic weight. The network consists of multiple tunnels excavated through the rocky limestone bedrock of the Beaufort Ridge to multiple levels of depth. The IDF has described it as an extensive underground complex built to accommodate hundreds of Hezbollah operatives simultaneously. That figure deserves repetition. Hundreds of operatives simultaneously. This is not a hiding place. This is not a weapons cache with a crawl space above it. This is an underground military base with the capacity to house, sustain, and operationally direct a significant fighting force beneath terrain that the IDF was operating above for weeks before the full extent of the network became clear. The infrastructure inside the network reflects a level of engineering investment that goes far beyond what an improvised or financially constrained organization could produce. Living quarters with bunk beds and personal storage, shower facilities and restrooms, kitchens with food preparation infrastructure, a functioning operating room with advanced medical equipment, electrical systems powering the entire complex, water supply and distribution, communications infrastructure for coordinating operations across the network, anti-tank missile launchers and munitions stored in dedicated weapons rooms, shoulder-fired missiles, grenades, combat equipment maintained in ready condition, in one tunnel approximately 1 kilometer in length, troops located 6 underground shafts, weapon storage areas, anti-tank missile launchers, anti-tank missiles, grenades, and multiple categories of combat equipment alongside the living infrastructure I just described. The shafts are operationally significant in a specific way that I want to address directly. These are not ventilation openings, they are firing shafts, vertical channels cut through the rock to the surface through which rockets and missiles can be launched at Israeli territory, while the operators remain below ground, protected from airstrikes, invisible to surveillance, functioning as a weapon system that the IDF could see the effects of but could not locate the source of until ground forces physically entered the tunnel and mapped the network from inside. The IDF also found, and this detail should be studied carefully by anyone trying to understand the strategic depth of what Hezbollah was building here, maps of northern Israeli communities inside the tunnel network, detailed maps showing the communities of the Galilee Panhandle, the terrain between the Lebanese border and the Israeli population centers, the routes that ground forces would use if the network was ever activated for its intended purpose. Those maps are not the maps of an organization that was thinking defensively. They are the maps of an organization that was planning an offensive operation against Israeli territory and had built the underground infrastructure required to stage and direct that operation from a position that Israeli air power could not reach and Israeli ground forces could not find without the kind of sustained penetration operation that only became possible when Beaufort Castle was seized and the entrance to the network could be approached. The IDF spokesman Brigadier General Effie Defrin described the site clearly in his public statement, and I want to quote the operational substance of what he said because it matters. The underground network consists of multiple levels excavated deep into the rocky ground. The entire network was built over more than a decade with full funding and planning by the Iranian terror regime. The site served as a significant command and control center where hundreds of Hezbollah operatives were stationed. From there, Hezbollah directed terror activities and carried out terrorist plans, including during the current conflict. That last phrase is the one I want you to hold on to, including during the current conflict. This network was not a historical artifact. It was not a construction project that predated the fighting and became irrelevant when the war began. It was operationally active. Hezbollah was directing fighting from beneath Beaufort Castle while Israeli forces were operating above it. The command and control for attacks against IDF troops, Israeli civilians, was being exercised from a facility that the IDF did not control and could not destroy from the air because it was carved into bedrock 25 meters below the surface. The hundreds of operatives who had been stationed there fled when the IDF launched its operation. The IDF captured footage of them inside the tunnels. Some who tried to escape were tracked from the air and killed in strikes after they exited the network, but the network itself, the physical infrastructure, the doctrine it represents, the investment of a decade, and the full financial and technical resources of the Iranian state, That is what the discovery at Beaufort confronts every military planner with in the most concrete terms available. Now let me turn to the question of who built this, because the answer is not simply Hezbollah, and the distinction between Hezbollah as the implementing organization and Iran as the designing and funding authority matters enormously for understanding what the Beaufort network represents strategically. The IDF has been precise about the attribution, and the evidence supports the precision. This was not built to Hezbollah standards. This was built to Iranian standards. IDF officials who assessed the Kontara tunnel network, the largest Hezbollah tunnel complex found in southern Lebanon, during the 2024 operations, said the construction reflected uniquely Iranian levels of professionalism compared to other Hezbollah tunnels. The engineering methodology, the structural techniques, the organization of the internal spaces, the integration of the weapons infrastructure with the living infrastructure, these reflected the involvement of Iranian engineers who brought capabilities and construction knowledge that Hezbollah's own organizational capacity would not have produced independently. The IDF found trademark Iranian weapons inside the network. The funding was Iranian, the planning was Iranian, the construction supervision was Iranian. What Hezbollah provided was the Lebanese territory, the local knowledge of the terrain, the labor force for the excavation, and the operational personnel who would eventually use the network for its intended purpose. What Iran provided was everything else. The financing that sustained a decade-plus construction project across multiple sites in southern Lebanon simultaneously, the engineering expertise to design multi-level tunnel systems cut into limestone bedrock that would survive Israeli airstrikes, the weapons systems stored inside the tunnels, many of which are Iranian-produced or Iranian-supplied, the strategic concept that determined what the tunnels would be used for. The Beaufort Castle discovery is not an isolated find. I want to be clear about this because the public coverage has occasionally treated it as though it represents the totality of what the IDF has found underground in Lebanon. It does not. In April of this year, 2 months before the Beaufort revelation, the IDF announced it had destroyed the largest Hezbollah tunnel complex found in southern Lebanon near Kantara, 11 kilometers from the Israeli border. That network was 2 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide, with the IDF describing it as a tunnel city capable of housing and providing weapons, communications and operational infrastructure for thousands of Radwan Force fighters. Thousands. In the same month, the IDF announced the destruction of 2 additional tunnel networks in Rab al-Thalathin and Mays al-Jabal, collectively spanning 2 kilometers in total length, built to depths of 25 meters, designed according to the IDF as staging grounds where hundreds of operatives could gather equipment and prepare themselves to attack Israeli towns as part of what the IDF described as Hezbollah's plan to conquer the Galilee. 3 weeks ago at Majd al-Zoun, 10 kilometers into southern Lebanon, the IDF's 551st Brigade seized a tunnel 200 meters long and 25 meters deep, with 4 firing shafts aimed at Israeli territory, killing 20 Hezbollah fighters in the process, including 10 members of the elite Radwan Force. What this pattern of discoveries tells us is not that the IDF has found Hezbollah's tunnel network. It tells us that what the IDF has found so far is a fraction of what Iran and Hezbollah have been building in southern Lebanon for the better part of 2 decades, and that every network discovered and destroyed is one component of a distributed underground architecture whose full extent no one outside of Hezbollah and Iranian command has complete knowledge of. The IDF has found tunnel cities, it has found command centers, it has found weapons depots, it has found firing positions, it has found living quarters built to sustain hundreds of operatives for extended periods. It has found maps of Israeli communities inside underground rooms beneath Lebanese villages. The question that every serious military analyst is grappling with is not whether these networks existed. They have been confirmed. The question is what the portion that has not yet been discovered looks like, where it sits in relation to IDF operating positions, and what it would take to activate it if Hezbollah's leadership decided that the conditions for the operation these tunnels were built to support had arrived. That question brings me to the third dimension of this analysis, which is the operational vulnerability that the Beaufort discovery exposes for any ground force operating in terrain that contains an adversary's underground infrastructure. I want to state this as directly as professional responsibility allows. The fundamental problem that the Beaufort Tunnel network illustrates for IDF ground operations in Lebanon is one that has no clean solution in the current operational environment, and it is a problem that military forces from every alliance facing underground capable adversaries are studying with increasing urgency. When you operate a ground force above a tunnel network that your adversary controls, you are not operating in a two-dimensional environment where your position on the surface gives you knowledge of what is happening around you. You are operating in a three-dimensional environment where a significant and potentially decisive portion of your threat picture exists below the ground you are standing on, invisible to your surveillance, unreachable by your direct fire weapons, and accessible to your adversary through entry points that may be located behind your forward line of troops. Inside the villages your forces have passed through and assessed as clear, beneath the roads your supply convoys use, and under the structures you have established as headquarters and command positions. The specific operational danger that the Beaufort network illustrates is what happens when a ground force's understanding of the terrain it controls is based on what it can see on the surface, while the adversary's operational capacity is located below what the ground force can see. The IDF was operating in the Beaufort area for weeks before the full extent of the network became clear. During that period, Hezbollah operatives were below them, directing operations, coordinating rocket fire, managing the communications that kept the organization's fighting capacity functional, while the forces above ground worked to destroy what they could find at the surface level. The IDF's discovery of the network came not from sensors, not from signals intelligence alone, not from aerial surveillance, but from the physical act of entering the ridge after capturing the castle and following the tunnels downward with combat engineers and commandos. That is the only method that consistently works against a well-built underground network in limestone terrain with 25 meters of rock between the tunnels and the surface. And it is a method that is slow, expensive in personnel risk, and dependent on having already seized control of the surface terrain above the network's primary access points. The IDF seized Beaufort Castle on May 31st. The tunnel network beneath it was revealed on June 7th, 7 days between taking the surface position and being able to characterize what was below it. 7 days during which Hezbollah's operators were evacuating what they could and destroying what they could not take with them. Hezbollah had built the exit of its command structure into this timeline. The tunnel was designed to be used until the surface above it was controlled by the IDF, and then to be evacuated in the window between IDF surface control and IDF underground penetration. The operatives fled. The infrastructure was left because it could not be moved, but the personnel who operated it, the commanders who directed the fighting from beneath Beaufort Castle while the ridge was contested above them, those personnel were withdrawn through routes that the IDF did not yet control when the evacuation occurred. This is not a failure of IDF tactics. It is the operational logic of underground warfare executed by an organization that had 10 years to build the network and had planned its evacuation procedure from the first day of construction. The broader implication for military planners is the one that is generating the most serious discussion in the defense establishments watching this conflict. If a network of this scale and sophistication can be built beneath a strategic ridge 6 kilometers from the Israeli border, operated through an active conflict, used to direct fighting and fire rockets at Israeli territory, and evacuated in good order when IDF ground forces finally gained the surface position needed to approach it from above, then the construction of underground warfare doctrine represents a genuine asymmetric capability against which conventional military superiority at the surface level provides incomplete protection. NATO planners studying this conflict are not looking at Beaufort Castle in isolation. They are asking what the same doctrine looks like applied to their own operational environments. The Pentagon is asking what underground infrastructure of this type looks like in theaters where American forces would operate. Military establishments from Seoul to Warsaw are absorbing the operational lesson that an adversary with a decade of preparation time, the financial resources of a regional state sponsor, and the engineering expertise of an organization that has made underground warfare its primary strategic investment can create a threat environment that surface-level military superiority does not automatically defeat. And they are right to ask those questions because what Iran built beneath Beaufort Castle is not unique to Lebanon. It is a doctrine, and doctrines travel. Now let me turn to the final dimension of this analysis, which is where the conflict stands in light of what the Beaufort discovery tells us about what remains unresolved. The IDF destroyed the Kantara tunnel city with 450 tons of explosives in April. The explosions were so large that seismic monitoring equipment across the region registered them. The Geological Survey of Israel initially assessed the blasts as a significant seismic event before clarifying that they were controlled demolitions. 450 tons of explosives to destroy one tunnel network. The Beaufort network is being systematically demolished by combat engineers from the Yahalom unit operating under the 36th Division. The Majd al-Zun tunnel, with its firing shafts aimed at Israeli territory, was neutralized by the 551st Brigade. Each of these operations represents a genuine tactical success. The IDF found the network. The IDF destroyed the network. The firing shafts that could not be destroyed from the air because they were shielded by 25 meters of rock can now be neutralized from close range. That is real operational progress, and it should be acknowledged as such. But the strategic question that the pattern of discoveries forces every honest analyst to confront is this: if the networks that have been found and destroyed represent a fraction of what was built, and the evidence strongly suggests they do, then what does the portion that has not been found look like? How many tunnel cities have not yet been discovered? How many command networks are still operational beneath terrain that the IDF does not yet control? How many firing shafts still exist in positions that Israeli forces have not yet reached? The IDF's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, stated publicly in late June that the ceasefire reached in the current period is, in his words, shaky, and that Israel needs to be ready with the highest preparedness to renew military action. He said all of the IDF's resources are dedicated to this. The operational basis for that assessment is exactly what the tunnel discoveries have revealed. A ceasefire negotiated at the surface level does not resolve what exists beneath the surface. The tunnel infrastructure that Iran and Hezbollah have invested a decade building in southern Lebanon does not disappear when a ceasefire agreement is reached. It remains. It is maintained, potentially rebuilt where it has been destroyed, extended into new areas in the months and years that follow any reduction in IDF's operational pressure in the region. The IDF's discovery inside the Beaufort tunnels of maps of northern Israeli communities built into the command infrastructure of an underground network designed to house hundreds of fighters and direct operations against those communities tells you everything you need to know about the strategic purpose that the tunnel doctrine serves. It is not defensive. It is not designed to help Hezbollah survive Israeli pressure. It is designed to enable Hezbollah to project offensive capability against Israeli population centers from a position that Israeli air power cannot reach and Israeli ground forces can only neutralize through the kind of sustained ground operation that the current ceasefire framework is designed to prevent. The diplomatic dimension compounds the operational one in ways that the IDF leadership has stated publicly it is concerned about. Israeli officials have expressed direct concern that a potential agreement between Washington and Tehran could include understandings on Lebanon that limit Israeli freedom of action against Hezbollah. The worry in Jerusalem, stated explicitly in reporting from the period surrounding the Beaufort discovery, is that Washington might pressure Israel to show restraint against Hezbollah in Lebanon in order to avoid endangering a broader deal with Iran. That pressure, if it materializes, would be applied to a military situation in which the IDF has found and destroyed several major tunnel networks, but has not yet achieved the kind of comprehensive underground assessment that would tell it how much of the system remains intact and operational. A ceasefire that limits IDF operations before that assessment is complete leaves in place an underground infrastructure whose full dimensions are unknown and whose strategic purpose has been made unmistakably clear by everything found inside the networks that have been discovered. In Moscow, the strategic assessment of the Beaufort discovery connects to a broader calculation about the return on Iran's investment in Hezbollah's military infrastructure. Russia has watched the tunnel discoveries with the professional attention of a military establishment that has its own experience with underground warfare doctrine and that understands better than most Western analysts what it means operationally to have built this kind of infrastructure into terrain that a conventional military force cannot rapidly neutralize. The investment that Iran made in building multi-level tunnel cities in southern Lebanese limestone over a period of more than a decade, funded and planned at the level of an Iranian state construction project, represents a strategic commitment of resources and institutional energy that produced exactly the kind of asymmetric capability the investment was designed to produce. Whether the current conflict resolves through negotiation before the IDF has completed its underground clearance operations, or whether the operational pressure continues until a more comprehensive, or whether assessment is possible, the existence of the tunnel doctrine and its physical expression beneath ridges like Beaufort Castle will remain the central strategic challenge of any long-term security arrangement for northern Israel. In Beijing, the tunnel doctrine is being studied as a precision example of how a financially and technically supported non-state organization can create military infrastructure that conventional military superiority cannot rapidly neutralize, extending the strategic depth of the sponsoring state's regional influence through an underground architecture that survives the air campaigns and long-range missile strikes that conventional military planning prioritizes.